We are in uncertain times, and with that, we are starting a new series on Moses. And this is going to stretch out all the way for a while. This is going to be a long series. It's going to be during our moving process as we move out and as we wander. We're going to go through this series talking about Moses. And every sermon is going to have a key theme to the message. And today's theme for today's message is faith. Our church relocation, we're still praying for it, so everybody keep praying. It's expected to happen soon. But this season could be a very uncomfortable season in our lives until we actually get into a new building. And even if we get into a new building, we might have to rent. So we won't be able to use the facilities as comfortably as we do in this current building. We won't have the freedom to do whatever we want. So PMOC even labeled our church during this season, we're the wilderness church. Just as the Israelites followed Moses through the desert, we too, we're going to be in this wilderness transition period. The wilderness, it's a place of discomfort. It's a season where you lack things. It's a season where you got to give up a lot of things, temporarily, hopefully, but it could be a temporary season where you got to give up a lot of things. And you know what? The wilderness can also be a place of loneliness and solitude. And in the wilderness, you cannot act as you please. And the uncertainty of what might come next, that can make a lot of people anxious and uneasy. And you know what? That's why the Israelites complained over and over and over as they were wandering in the wilderness, the desert. When life is abundant, right, we take so many things for granted. In abundance, often we don't have to actually truly admit things. We don't have to truly face ourselves. But in the wilderness, we're forced to look at reality, and often we're forced to reflect on ourselves and think about ourselves. And the wilderness can be a place of reflection and an honest prayer. It's a place where we can actually say honestly what's happening in our lives. What am I truly struggling with? And it's also a place where we can rediscover what we have lost. And in this season of being in the wilderness, the thing that we need most is faith. Because God alone leads our steps out in the desert. In Exodus 13:21, the Lord went ahead of him. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. Here's one thing in this season that we need to remember. Even in the desert, even in the wilderness, when everything seems uncertain, and when everything feels like it's so dry that there's no life, God is still with us, whether by day or night. Keep in mind, in the wilderness, your experience and knowledge, it doesn't matter anymore. You don't get to figure out everything. You don't get to understand everything in the wilderness. Nor should you feel trapped to this pressure, man, I have to understand everything while I'm suffering. Man, in this season, I must know everything to move forward. But here's the thing, knowledge and experience does not get you forward in the wilderness. Only God does. That's why in this desert season, in this transition period, we must have faith and keep our eyes on God every step of the way. And of course, there is amazing grace in the wilderness because it's by His grace we'll go forward. It's by His grace we will survive. And it's by His grace we get to experience His great power and miracles. Soon, we're going to be entering that wilderness period ourselves. So you have to prepare your hearts. Remember, God is with us no matter what, whether in the desert, whether we have a fancy building or not, whether we are in a tent, whether we are renting, God is with us. And God will help us enter that promised land with joy and thanksgiving. So we You need to remember that this is going to be a tough period, so get your hearts ready, but do it with expectation and hope that God is going to get us through and better things are yet to come. Many of you here today, not just a church setting, not just a church going through a transition, but many of you here today, whether young or old, you've had seasons of being in the wilderness in your life. In fact, the Bible is filled with people who walked through the wilderness. Abraham left his hometown. He left everything he knew to obey God and go to a new land. Jacob fled after deceiving his father and brother. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers, spent years in prison. David, who was anointed king of Israel, wandered the wilderness because he was being hunted by King Saul, and later he was betrayed by his own son. The prophet Elijah ran for his life because Jezebel was out to kill him. John the Baptist was in prison for speaking the truth and rebuking a king. Paul was arrested for preaching the gospel and beheaded for it. John, the disciple John, was exiled on an island. Even Jesus himself was tested out in the wilderness by Satan. Many people will go through tough times in their lives. Moses especially had to endure a very tough time in the wilderness. He was born into a Hebrew family, but the Egyptians oppressed the Hebrews, forcing them to harsh labor and mistreating them. And at that time, Pharaoh issued a decree that all the newborn Hebrew boys must be thrown into the Nile so they would be eaten by the crocodiles. It was in this climate that Moses was born. His parents were from the tribe of from the Levi, and by law, Moses should have been thrown into the Nile. But instead, his mother hid him for 3 months. Exodus 2, verse 2, the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. She saw that he was a special child. Other translations say that he was a beautiful child. The Hebrew word used here is tov. Those of you who know Hebrew or have heard of Hebrew or will hopefully maybe one day get to study key Hebrew words will know that tov is a very critical word in the Bible because it's repeated many times in Genesis 1. And the word that's repeated in Genesis 1 is the word good. God created it and said it was good. That word is tov, same word to describe Moses. When God created light, he said it was good. When he created the land and the sea, he said it was good. All the creatures that he created, he said it was good. And after all the creation, he looked over the world and he said, it was good. And in the same way, Moses' mother saw him and said, he is good. He's special. Moses' parents saw something good in him. And what a forecast that a new creation story, a new generation of Israel would be led by Moses. However, no matter how precious this child was, their parents could no longer hide him from Pharaoh. So Moses' mother placed him in the river and let him go. Exodus 2, verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. Can you imagine what that's like? Your newborn baby. She doesn't know what's going to happen to this boy, but she puts him in a basket and she lets him go, just floating along the water. There are moments in life when you're going to have to just let go. Everyone say, let go. Not let it go. Everyone say, let go. There's going to be times in your life where you're just going to have to let things go out of your hands because it doesn't matter no longer what you do, no matter how hard you work at it, no matter how hard you try, it is no longer up to you. and it is in God's hand. It's no longer up to your strength, but it's in the hands of God. This is also true for our church relocation process. How amazing it would have been if everything just worked out perfectly. The timing worked perfectly with the selling and the buying, and everything just worked out so smoothly, and no delays and no headaches. We didn't think that it would happen like this. We tried to make it as smooth as possible, but this is where we are. Sometimes this is how it can feel when dealing with tough times. It's like putting something precious like a baby in a basket and letting it flow away from you. What's interesting is the Hebrew word for basket is tebah. In the Old Testament, this word is mentioned only twice. The first time is actually to describe Noah's Ark. And the second time is actually to describe Moses' basket. So how interesting, the word for Noah's Ark and the word for Moses' basket uses the same word. Though vastly different in size, the ark and this basket have many similarities. Number one, both are designed to protect life from danger. In Noah's time, the ark saved lives from judgment from the flood. For Moses, the basket saved him from Pharaoh's decree to kill all the Hebrew boys. The second thing they have in common is they both float in water. In the ancient Near East, water symbolized uncontrollable evil or chaos. The word tebah kept Noah and Moses from being swallowed up by the waters of destruction. It's so crazy because water is so precious to us. Without it, like we would die. What they say, 3 days, most of us, that's all we would survive without water. In a safe container, how precious water is, but in the wild, in the vast oceans, large amounts of water, how terrifying it is. I heard some experts say still to this day, we've only discovered less than 25% of the ocean's floor. That's how crazy it is to explore open waters. The final thing that's common for both Noah's Ark and Moses' basket is that there is no way to steer this vessel. As big and vast as Noah's Ark was, there was no steering mechanism. There was no way to turn it. It was in God's hand. And as small as the basket was for Moses, there was no way to control where it would go. Salvation and future was in God's hands alone. But here's the thing, we must remember our future, our salvation too, rests on God's hand. So even in dangerous, treacherous waters, and even when you're just drifting in the Nile, you have to have faith and trust in God. And just as God had plans for Moses, his basket was found by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter. Exodus 2, verse 5 to 6, soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maids to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. You have to remember, it was Pharaoh himself that said, all Hebrew boys must be thrown in the Nile so they would be eaten up by crocodiles, so they would all die. But it's Pharaoh's own daughter who has compassion for Moses. There's no other explanation for this than God's intervention. It was Pharaoh's own daughter that saved Moses' life. Not only that, she adopted him and raised him in the royal palace. This is how often God works in our lives. Sometimes it feels like there's no way, things are impossible, but he still makes a way, and he actively works in our lives. God had planted compassion, his divine nature, into the heart of Pharaoh's daughter. The child was destined to die, but instead was rescued. Not by anybody, but someone with power and wealth and influence. And that very leader who would lead Israel, the next generation out of Egypt, was actually raised in the palace. Egypt's own taxes paid for Moses' upbringing. Can you imagine that? That's how grace works sometimes. It's unimaginable, but it often goes much beyond than we can ever fathom. We can never fully measure God's greatness. We can never fully understand everything he does. Sometimes it's only after years later we find out that God was with us all along. What matters most is, in those uncertainties, can you surrender and trust God and leave it up to his hands, even when it looks like the storm is before us? Even though it looks like the Nile is just full of crocodiles waiting to devour us, can you still trust God's timing and trust his ways? Hebrews 11:6 says, "And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him." Here's the thing. Many of you believe in God, but many of you are not really sure that he blesses people. Many of you are not really sure God actually rewards those with faith. So you kind of believe in God and go, yeah, God, I believe you, but man, I don't know if things are going to go well in my life. God, I believe you exist, but I'm not sure that you really love me that much. But faith, there's two components: that you believe God exists, but that also means you believe he intervenes in your life, that he rewards you, he shows you grace, he shows you understanding and his love. We don't know all of his plans. Ecclesiastes 3:11, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. God has made everything beautiful in his own time. We don't understand everything, but can you still believe that he's working for good on his own schedule, on his time? Because trust me, when you want things done, you want it on God's time, not your time. Sometimes God intentionally holds stuff from us. He intentionally hides some stuff from us, because if you knew all of his great plans, you would run away like half the prophets did in the Old Testament. Even if you do not fully know God, can you trust that he fully knows you and he knows what's best for you? Isn't that enough? Do you have to understand everything about him? Could we truly fully understand? For those of you who are in relationship, did you marry your spouse because you know everything about that person? Students, do you know everything about your parents? Know all their thoughts, all the details? Yet you obeyed many things that they told you to do. Parents, you don't know everything about your child, yet you love them. You cannot, with your tiny brain, fathom and fully understand all of God's wonders, all of God's plan for you. But can you still trust that he loves me? He intervenes in my life. Even when there's crocodiles, even when there's a storm, that he's still with me. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, "My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts," says the Lord. God saying, you think you could dare understand me? No. And my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. For just as heaven are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God's work does not require our full understanding. God does not need our approval to do his mighty works. Christian faith is not about full comprehension and full knowledge, but it's about trusting in God, surrendering to his will, placing things in God's hand, living in obedience. The Israelites did not escape Egypt because they fully understood God's plan for the Exodus. The people followed Moses because they trusted him. Interestingly, the name Moses was actually given to him by Pharaoh's daughter. It's an Egyptian name. Exodus 2:10 Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. Contrary to popular opinion, the name Moses is not a Hebrew name, it's an Egyptian name. He was adopted by Pharaoh's princess. In fact, the name Moses plainly means the word son. But if you actually read Moses' name through Hebrew, Moses' name is actually linked to the word Masha, which means to draw out, to rescue. How interesting. An ordinary plain name was given to him. Moses, my son, by Pharaoh's princess. But how interesting, if you look at the language through Hebrew, that word actually means to draw out, to rescue. So you get a different perspective. From the Egyptian's perspective, he's just a son. From God's perspective, he's the one that I rescued. He's the one that I saved. Let me tell you, this is true for our lives as well. The world will tell you that you are a certain way. The world will look at you a certain way. But God will say, no, I see differently. You're not just anyone, but you're my child, my saved one, my chosen generation. You're called for a purpose. When you begin to see things with faith, what seemed impossible starts to become visible and possible. We start to see God's power, His guidance. From a worldly perspective, it's foolish to go into the wilderness. Voluntarily going into a wild land that's uninhabitable, no life, no food. How crazy it is from the world's perspective to enter the wilderness. Who would dare risk their lives and their future by entering such desolate place? But when you look at the wilderness through God's eyes, it's a place full of grace. It's a place of provision. It's a place where God can keep you safe. By day, a cloud, a pillar of cloud, and by night, a pillar of fire. The Lord protects His people from scorching sun by putting up the cloud. And He provides heat by night by a pillar of fire. When there's no water, He provides water through the rocks. Look, relocating a church is never easy. But can you have faith that ultimately everything will work out for good? As long as there are people in this church who believe in God, who trust in God, who will put things in God's hand, guess what? This church has a future. Habakkuk 2:4 says, look at the proud. They trust in themselves and their lives are crooked. But the righteous live by their faithfulness to God. As God's children, we live by faith. We don't live according to worldly knowledge and worldly perspective. We don't live by material possessions. We don't live by personal achievements and our own abilities. The righteous live by faith. I said the theme for today's sermon is faith, and that's the most important thing that we need as we enter into this wilderness journey. God does not ignore the prayer of those who believe in faith. And by the way, be very, very careful in this season how you talk. You are not God, so do not put a conclusion where God is still working. Do not assume things are going to turn out a certain way when God is still leading us. That goes the same for each of us. Do not put a period where God is still working in people's lives. Don't draw a conclusion and be negative about people when there's still hope for them. Instead, speak faith over people. Speak faith and love over the people and say, God is with you. He's still working in your life. Are you struggling? Don't worry, God is with you. Do you have sickness? Can you trust in God that He can heal you? Look at what Jesus said when he healed the blind, Matthew 9:29. Then he touched their eyes and said, because of your faith, it will happen. Because of your faith, it will happen. God is not limited to anything, but he wants to see our faith. Can you actually believe the things that you are speaking into your lives? Numbers 14:28. Now tell them this, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. So be careful what you say. Speak life, speak truth, and speak faith. If we lack faith or feel uncertain, we should ask for God. In Jesus' ministry, there was a father whose son was demon-possessed, and he came before Jesus and said, help us if you can. Jesus, I don't know if you can help me, but I'm desperate. Can you help me? If you can do anything about my son, can you help me? And Jesus says, anything is possible for those who believe. And the father instantly cried out, verse 24, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. Even when we lack faith, it's God that helps us get through. But it's up for you to choose. In this season where you want to grumble and complain because it's going to be uncomfortable in the wilderness, that's what you can speak. You can speak death, you can speak division, you can speak harm. Or in this season, despite the tough season, despite the discomfort, you can say, I believe God is with us. I believe God loves me. And not just for this church, but in your life. Things might not be going well, but you can declare in your life, God loves me and he is for me. Whether I am in the desert, whether I'm in the midst of a storm, whether I'm in a basket floating among crocodiles, God is with me. So what will you declare in your life? And so I'm asking you today as a church, declare faith in your life and say, God is with us no matter what. But it's up to you to choose. I can't choose for you, and God wants your heart. So I'm asking you, choose faith no matter what comes your way. We all stand. Let's all pray.